Thanks, Julie.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AFP's Getting Started on Your Mobility Deployment webinar. I'm delighted to introduce myself, Julie Semrall. I'm an AFP Director and your host for today. I'm also like to introduce my colleague, James Pestle, who's also an AFP Director. Our presenters today are Dale Einan from DEFRA, Oz Chowdhury from Enterprise, Ross Basnett from Mobilio. We finish with Ryan Coles, who's also an AFP committee member, who'll give us his thoughts on mobility deployment from a fleet manager's perspective. Before we begin the presentation, I'd just like to advise you that we'll be recording the webinar to allow members to review the content at a later stage. And we'll be having the Q&A session following our presentations. So please feel free to place any questions in the chat box. I'd like to hand over to Dale now from DEFRA to present to us. Thank you, Dale.
Morning, everybody. I think most of you know me, so I haven't included any slides this morning in terms of who we are and what we do, but I think hopefully a lot of you will know already that DEFRA Group, we provide fleet services to about 12 organisations within a government department, either core organisations or what we call arm's length bodies. We manage around about 10,000 assets. It's a pretty mixed fleet, so we have about 6,000 vehicle assets and then around 4,000 plant and boat assets as well, so quite a mixed bag. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you a bit today about our journey with looking at mobility as a service. I'm not sure I necessarily like the name, but we can't think of anything better to describe it. So that's what we're all referring to and what the press refers it to. So I'll call it that. So we've wondered for a long time whether we should be looking at alternatives to the company car as a way of getting our staff around. And looking at the objectives on the screen you've got in front of you, there's a lot there. I won't read them all out to you, but what we're looking for essentially was a solution that combined people's need for private usage of a vehicle, and that might vary from weekend to weekend or week to week. We wanted to also cover the commuting angle, and we also wanted to obviously primarily look at the business angle as well. So for every part of someone's life, whether it's business, commuting or private, how can we provide them with a way of getting around? So the mobility trial that we're undertaking is looking into how we might be able to do that. We were planning to do this before COVID. Obviously, we had to postpone that because there was no one in offices. So we're starting the trial in April next year. We're just in the process of sorting out some bits and pieces with our partners, and then we'll look to do an implementation within Q1 of next year, and then start it from April onwards. We are looking at all travel modes, so we're looking at bus, trains, cars, and all sorts of different options with hire, lease, flexi rent, car share, you name it. We're looking at all those options. And what we're really trying to do is move people away from the concept of ownership to usership. So in other words, a lot like other products in the marketplace, do I need to own a car 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year, or do I actually just need access to a car when I want one? But I want a bit more than just booking a car club car, for example. So it's looking at that whole travel pattern, and eventually we'll incorporate electric bikes and other things into it. So looking at how we get people around in all aspects of their life, really. This is quite a big shift from where we all are at the moment, where we all own vehicles. And there's some terrible statistic that 90% of vehicles spend most of their time stationary. So we spend a lot of time that the vehicles are not doing anything. So, in terms of climate emergency and better usage of assets, we need to look at a different solution. We also need to reflect on the post-COVID world we live in. Travel has reduced. It might not feel like that when we're out on the roads at the moment, when it feels like it's back to pre-COVID levels of travel on the roads and transport, but people's travel patterns have changed. People are working from home more, people aren't going to the office as much, and we need to reflect that to make sure anything we do meets changing business needs, but also helps people. It's a big leap for people, so we need to make sure people are on board with what we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. So what's the scope about? We don't believe, and I'm sure someone might try and correct me, but we don't believe there's a single player in the market at the moment that can provide the full range of mobility that we're looking at. So what we've done is we've worked closely with one of our key partners, Enterprise, who effectively have brought a consortium of people together. You can see there, so working with Enterprise, LiftShare, Mobilio, TMC, and all those partners bring very different things to the party in terms of how we can provide a mobility service going forwards. It's all platform driven, so you need a great IT platform. We're hoping that's what Fleet on Demand will provide, and it'll be copied across to us in terms of adapted to how it wants to look in our own organisation. LiftShare is really important because what we want to do is try and get people into the office in the lowest carbon way possible, those that need to come into the office. The Environment Agency wants to be net carbon zero by 2030. And the particular scientific model we use to calculate that includes supply chain and commuting. So we've got to think about the commuting element here. How can we get people into offices and depots in the lowest carbon way possible, which might mean public transport, it might mean sharing facilities, it might mean using electric bikes, it's all sorts of things. And data, I've mentioned before on various calls, data is always king. We need to make sure we're getting the right set of data and information and intelligence to make sure that the decisions we're making for the future are based on really robust principles and intelligence. You can collect huge amounts of data and we probably only use a very small percentage of it. So we want to make sure we collect the right intelligent data so that we can manage our mobility and transport going forwards in a very intelligent way, using technology, using partners. So we could move on to the next slide, please. So what are we going to get out of all this? It seems like a very big approach. So we'll end up with our own branded mobility system, and most providers can offer you with this. We'll have that available to people either on iPhones, iPads, laptops, whatever people need. And we'll need to make sure it's a really easy log on and really easy access to it to make sure people can get what they need from it as quickly as possible. We'll have all sorts of travel mode in there, so it will connect to our travel providers for hotel bookings, train bookings, and even have a link through to local bus and taxi companies if we wanted to, so that people truly have lots of options in terms of mobility. We're not, in terms of many of these issues like hotels and rail links, we're just putting an API in place to our current providers. We're not trying to do anything more spectacular than that, so that people can book everything on one platform. The truly integrated solution will come at a later date, and we're hoping that the results of this trial will enable us to go to a full mobility as a service contract in the next 2 to 3 years, whereas at the moment we don't think that's possible. We also need to have the option available for employees to either indicate something is business or personal travel. So what we don't want to do is have two separate systems, because if you don't integrate the whole of someone's journeys, whether it's private or public business, then they won't want to use the system. So we need to make sure that, one, we're in line with HMRC rules about BIK and benefits, but also to make sure that it provides the business solutions as well. Eventually, we see a place where we will give staff mobility credits, and they can use those mobility credits how they wish to. Because we're not allowed to provide staff with any specific benefits, you could use mobility credits to provide benefits as well. So someone who doesn't use all their credits might be able to cash them in or exchange them for something. We're not currently allowed to do that with the government, but we're looking at those sorts of initiatives for the future. So mobility credits will not necessarily be part of the trial, but we will be investigating them as part of the trial to see whether we could deliver that in the future. Obviously, we need consolidated invoicing, so we will need to make this system run as smooth as possible. What we don't want is a whole stack of different invoices that need paying to different people at different times. So integration of not just the data, but the invoicing is a really key issue. And the last bullet point on there is about tracking travel patterns. So we need to understand what people travel and how they travel, and try and link that into a type of reward system. That might simply mean making sure people get the best type of travel arrangements for their personal travel. So if they're using the bus or train a lot, we might be able to look at, part season tickets and all sorts of other things to help people do that. But we need to look at the longer term here about what the system could offer us in the future. And we'd ideally like to get to a place eventually where people all have individual carbon budgets for travel, and they can use those budgets how they want to. So, for example, if someone's using a very low carbon way of traveling, they might be able to travel more than someone who doesn't. So we're trying to see if we can incentivize it, but not in a way that's counterproductive to getting the work done. If I can look at the next slide, please. These things are not easy. We've spent a lot of time, and thank you to all our partners for supporting and helping us on this. We're looking to launch the approach in April at 3 sites. And we picked 3 very different sites. So we picked our national head office site, which is a shared office. So there are about 5 partners within DEFRA Group who share the office in Bristol. So it means we can look at increasing it, not just Environment Agency, but look at colleagues from AFA and RPA and MMO and Natural England, for example. And also Bristol is a very busy, big office in a city centre. So the challenges there will be different. We're also looking at sites in Yorkshire and East Anglia where perhaps public transport is not quite as abundant, or specific types of routes aren't easily available or are more expensive. So we're looking at different types of scenarios to really get a sense of what the art of the possible is here. And just to give you some comfort, we pick the sites rather than our suppliers or partners picking the site. So we want to see what works for us rather than what the system could work for. But we'll make sure that what we do reflects our total business, not just part of our business. We're also going to be looking at active travel across government, across DEFRA, across the EA. We are introducing active travel. So how do we promote walking and cycling? So this is not just about people getting in buses and cars and taxis. This is about, we've all seen the scooters around, but, could you go from your office to the station using a scooter or an electric bike? Could you go to, other options like that? So how do we encourage people? How do we get people to walk between places? What's the blocker there? Is it because of the traffic? Is it they don't know the route? So again, anything we can do to promote active travel helps with well-being and people's general sense of feeling better. Obviously, we'll be using telemetry. We'll be using various systems within our car fleet. We already have it in our commercial fleet, and we'll be looking to integrate that with data management and fuel management things as well. The lift share is an interesting one for us. So we will look at how we use best use of lift share. Lift share has been around for a while, but we're looking for a more intelligent application of how we can use that. So, for example, if there are lots of people who live in the same area, could we tie them together for lift share? Or could we actually get them to use the bus if the bus took a slightly different route, or if the bus was at a slightly different time? So again, we can work with lift share and with public transport suppliers to say, small changes in your operation would mean more customers and potentially more profit. So how can we link all those things in together as well? I can't emphasize enough how much of this needs employee engagement. A big part of the work we'll be doing in Q1 of next year before we go live is to really engage with our employees. It's got to be seen as something that's an advantage to them, something they want to do. It's got to be easy. It's got to be cost effective. If we don't make it any of those things, people will not use it. So part of the thing we're looking for here is, what's the cultural shift we have to make for people to want to use this new type of mobility systems. So we know bits of it won't be perfect, but the important stuff is the learning that comes out of it, so that when we go out to contract, we can look at the sorts of things that we need to get right before we do that. Next slide, please. So what are we hoping to get from all this? Why are we doing this? I've mentioned what the drivers for all this are and how we're managing the project, but we want to look at a change in travel behaviour. And that change in travel behaviour has to be linked to our net carbon zero ambitions, the climate emergency. It's the biggest issue facing us in the world today. And those of you that watched the news last night will see some of the Environment Agency's reporting on this, that we want to make people This is not shock and awe, but we want to make it really clear to people that as a country, we are not adapted yet to deal with the climate change. We are going to see more extreme weather patterns. We're going to see wetter winters, drier summers, but all those things will make it very challenging for us as an organisation and as a society. We've mentioned before we want to seed the market, and we want to see how we might go to the market in a few years' time with a proposition for mobility as a service. It's not been done before, so we'll need to be really careful about how we do this. And we also want to see what the impact is on people's behaviours when we give them choice and different options, and how they make those choices, and how we can then drive them into the greenest choices as well. We obviously want to move all business users wherever possible into electric vehicles, and that's whether it's a rental vehicle, a short-term lease or a long-term lease. For those that want to do that rather than to use a more mobility-driven solution, then obviously we need to make sure that's the right use for them as well. Data consolidation. We want to look at how we can better use data. We've talked about data warehousing for a while now. We have lots of sources of data. We need to make sure we've got them in a single place that gives us the best bang for our buck, that we can best use that data to drive the business and drive improvements. So that'll be a key part of this. Again, the learning is how can we better manage data in the future. There's obviously a lot of interest in our organisation from our board down as a way of managing, particularly post-COVID, where mobility as a service is gaining more traction and more engagement from people. People are really starting to see this as a possible way of moving people around in the future. And I think it's really important that we get all our senior stakeholders across government engaged with this. So we will work with colleagues from the Cabinet Office and various other departments to make sure we are getting that buy-in. Transport modes are really important. Transport modes are changing all the time. I live in Bristol, and we currently have a trial in Bristol for electric scooters called Voi, I think, which is a Dutch company. So we need to look at all the different options that are coming out and make sure we can include them where they're appropriate. There are all sorts of issues associated with some of these things, and we've all witnessed a scooter in front of us weaving around and on and off the pavement, which is not great. So we need to be careful what we offer staff in terms of business travel to make sure it's done in a safe and compliant way. So again, the future is changing in terms of what's available, and we need to make sure we are getting the relevance of that. And I think my final slide, please. So what can we take away from all this? I think the first thing for me is about, whilst this is a significant undertaking, we have a dedicated project manager. There's a lot of people behind the scenes working on this, and our partners are dedicating a lot of resource to this as well. So it is a significant undertaking. However, the social, environmental, and economic benefits we think are huge. And we think this is we're at the edge of something big here. So we think the gains and the benefits outweigh the resources needed to go into this. So don't be put off by this. But it is a resource intensive activity to start with. We understand that sharing is an interesting issue. I think given the choice at the moment, lots of us would not want to share things. We prefer to have our own things in front of us or sat in our drive in our garage so that it's there if we need it. So moving people away from ownership to sharing is a really interesting concept, and it's one that will be a bigger part of what we all do in the future. So again, we'll need to make sure we are looking at that challenge. So think about that cultural shift from ownership to sharing before you do anything. People have a very traditional way about thinking about fleet. So you need to make sure the organisation is ready for this, because there will be people who will just want the car 24/7. There will be others who are much more open to having a different type of solution. The next thing I'd say is I'm not sure there's any single organisation that can do this on their own. There may be some that say they can, but I'm not entirely sure they can. So this is about a partnership approach. We've searched the market for a few years now, and there is no silver bullet here about someone who can just deliver everything we want and be up and running with it. So we think you need to involve partnerships. Who leads that partnership, who takes the biggest part in that is something to be reviewed. But there are opportunities there for people as well. So think about partnerships. Try not to do this on your own, because it will be very challenging otherwise. Technology is a big part of this. You'd have thought 3 or 4 years ago we could pay for things with our phones. So technology moves on and on and on. You know, you can check what your car's doing. If it's charging, you can open the doors remotely. You can do lots of things now using technology. And we've got to embrace technology and make sure that everything we do is easy to use as well as technology and data driven. I often talk in my presentations about how some of these things are evolution rather than revolution. I do think mobility as a service has to be a revolution. I think there has to be a step change in how we get ourselves about and how we get ourselves about for business and for private use. We've seen some stuff coming along already, but I think to really move a big fleet to something different and to move an organization to something different, I think you've got to think bigger than just small step changes. And the final thing with all this, nothing will ever work without communication and engagement with the people using it and with stakeholders as well, actually. So whenever you're doing this, think about the plans you need to make in advance. Think about those that you need to engage, get their support, encouragement, enthusiasm, and have a really great set of people charging this through. And, you know, the 3 sites we've got will have ambassadors there who are pushing that service, who are promoting it. So it's a big chunk of energy you'll need for this to get people engaged and on board with this. So please don't think that's a relatively simple job. It is a big piece of work. And I think I'm out of time by a minute there, Julie, so I'll stop there and hand over to the next
brilliant.
one.
Thank you very much, Dale. That was very interesting. Our second presentation is a joint presentation from Oz Chowdhury of Enterprise and Ross Basnett from Mobilio. So over to you, Oz and Ross.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Dale. So like Julie mentioned, I'm part of a double act today. So by way of introduction, I'm Oz Chowdhury from Enterprise. James, would you mind going to the next slide? Just wanted to briefly introduce Enterprise to you, and then I'm going to talk to you about Car Club. So just by way of introduction, Enterprise has been operating now for over 25 years in the UK. We have about 4,000 staff covering about 480 locations across the UK. It's a very diverse workforce which reflects the communities that we service. We operate over 100,000 vehicles, ranging from very small cars to commercial vehicles to specialist commercial as well. And also when we look at the drivetrain, everything from electric, hybrid, diesel and ICE vehicles as well. So we've had a lot of experience in working in partnerships with both the private and public sector in deploying not only our sort of core products, such as vehicle hire, van hire, and also Car Club, but also in working with these partners to develop new solutions. So next slide, please, James. I think really key for me listening to Dale was we are definitely seeing as a mobility operator that the landscape is without a doubt changing and has done so for the last couple of years. Right at the heart of that change, I think, is decarbonisation. But what that's doing is it's really forcing both businesses and the public to consider their existing travel behaviour and look for more sustainable options. We're really seeing that when we engage with both our clients, both in the retail sector and also in the business sector, that they're looking for new solutions that are going to help them achieve what is probably their journey towards adopting sustainable travel, adopting a more healthier, active form of travel, and being conscious of kind of still the idea of great customer service or great experience when accessing these new solutions. So as part of today's presentation, I just wanted to introduce you to one of the products that has been very successful for us in helping lead this change in sort of adopting more sustainable travel. James, next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce Enterprise Car Club to you. It's been in existence now for over 10 years. And for Enterprise, it's a really exciting product that's continuing to grow. Right now, we have over 2,500 Car Club vehicles positioned in over 190 towns and cities. And we have a membership of about 175,000 users who actively use these Car Club vehicles. So just to explain what Car Club is, typically a Car Club vehicle is giving you shared access to a vehicle. The vehicles are fitted with telematics. I'm not going to get technical here on you, but that allows you to book these vehicles through an app. You don't need the key to access them because it's remotely unlocked. and you can book them for very small increments. Usually the minimum time is 15 minutes, and you can have them for booking for an hour, for 4 hours. You can have them for as long as you'd like, but typically we see people using the car club services, that on-demand services is for sort of up to 4 hours journey, maybe up to 40 kilometers maximum. It's really, really exciting for us to see the growth of Car Club, particularly the way people have adapted to using them. And I think what's important to realize is that there are different models in that the way that you can deploy this on-demand access to a vehicle. I really like Dale's point when he mentioned the fact that people are moving away from maybe the idea of ownership, and it's now more about access and shared access. Next slide, please, James. So when we look at the different business models for Car Club, just to briefly point what they are. So we've been deploying them in different scenarios. The first one is what we call a dedicated use. So that's where, and this is something that DEFRA has been doing for a while now, where they use them almost like a smart pool vehicle. Because these Car Club vehicles are very, very easy to access, it's access through technology, the app or through the desktop, and it's in real time so you can see when it's available. They run at high utilization. So they're very good for what we call being based at a company's location, on their real estate, their sort of footprint, and sort of being used as an alternative to maybe what could be an old pool vehicle, or just giving people access to on-demand vehicles. The other scenario, which is what we refer to as the virtual fleet, is where we often deploy car clubs through the local authorities. They will give us parking bays. It could be in the towns, in the urban areas, could even be in suburban or even rural areas. And they're designated bays where we can place a car club. And again, we're giving the general public access to a pay-as-you-go, the demand for the vehicles. Obviously, you'd expect there's a hybrid version as well. So what we are seeing, there's a lot of businesses who may use our Car Club for staff travel on core hours, maybe 9 to 5. But outside of those core hours, we're then opening them up to the general public. Particularly if you look at where your estate may be, you may be close to a residential area. So why not give people access to the vehicles when you're not using them? And then finally, we are also seeing a lot of companies who may already have a legacy fleet, whether that's leased or even outright purchased, where they are looking to put the technology in to help them better utilize or run the fleet. They're just trying to be more efficient. And the name of the game here is really running them at high utilization, but also giving people shared access, which is what Car Club's all about. Next slide, please, James. So we've got a bit of a story to tell you here, myself and Ross, and it very much follows the same theme that we saw from Dale. So this is a picture of Highland Council. There's Councillor Alan Henderson and Sam there from the fleet team at Highland Council. Back in 2018, they did a massive review of their travel. Unfortunately, they had a high reliance on staff travel through mileage reimbursement, or grey fleet to some of you. They were, I think, doing over 6 million miles a year at a cost of £2.2 million in reimbursement. So they asked Enterprise to come in, particularly with our Car Club model, and asked us, would that be able to help them displace some of that travel through mileage reimbursement? And we did a whole comprehensive review with them, and we launched our services. And it's been a real success for the Highland Council. In the first 12 months, they reduced, I think, their business miles by 825,000 miles. This is before COVID, by the way. And that led to a savings of about £400,000 just in terms of what they were reimbursing and the cost of actually running our assets. I think more importantly, and to Dale's point, they also saw a significant reduction in their CO2. I think it was equivalent to something like 370 tons reduced in the first 12 months. What was really important is that the staff were really engaged. So when we launched the Car Club, it was a great opportunity for them to understand where we should position it in relation to what was, convenient to them. We did a lot of on-site training of how you can access the car clubs. I think whenever there's something involving technology and, you need to get people to actually use it, force them out their comfort zones, get them to use it, realize that it's just a car, and the fact that you're unlocking it through an app, or maybe your staff a card, your RFID card, doesn't matter. It's just a normal car. And so with a lot of engagement, a lot of demonstrations, the Car Club has been a success, a huge success for the Highland Council. And I'm not surprised, because really, as a fleet operator, Highland Council were just looking to be more efficient. And they just hadn't really considered that in that toolkit that they have for sort of fleet management, whether that be through technology or through the way you purchase, lease or acquire assets, that there was other options. And Car Club isn't new. It's just that it probably hasn't been as heavily adopted in the business world compared to where in the retail, it's quite normal for people to maybe not own a second car, but use a Car Club as that second vehicle. So really excited about Highland Council, but there's a bit of a story there. And if you wouldn't mind, James, next slide, is that based on Highland Council, this is how they used it. You know, they saw that the Car Club was taking away the provision of what was an old pool fleet, also cannibalized some of that mileage reimbursement or grey fleet. And actually, we were their car hire provider and still are. We also were able to be more efficient and reduce their daily hire spend, particularly on that sort of one-day hire that was maybe not as efficient or as cost savings to them, and actually much more better placed through the Car Club model. Next slide, please, James. What is really interesting for me is that when COVID hit and the Highlands Council obviously saw, just like Dale mentioned, a lot of their staff working from home, they still maintained their Car Club fleet. And that's because one of the things they were conscious of, they wanted to look at some of the gains they had made prior to COVID and also what they were seeing as a transition during COVID. And I think the main point there, and something that Dale reflected on, was that they were starting to see the lines blur between the commuting pattern and the staff travel, whether that was historic or current. And so they wanted to really bank some of the gains they had made through Car Club, which had displaced some of that ownership and mileage reimbursement, but actually got people to share journeys, share assets. They also saw a huge reduction in CO2 and they wanted to maintain that during the lockdown. There was a massive increase in active travel because people were now starting to adopt public transport if they were giving up use of their vehicle, which meant they were also considering options like bike share or bike hire. Again, people were walking. So again, it was really, great behavior that they were looking to maintain through their staff travel. But also they could see that the reduction in the just overall travel, business travel as a whole, was a good thing and was actually a way to expedite some of the staff travel policies that they wanted to bring in. The threat, though, that they saw and why they retained their Car Club fleet was that there was obviously during COVID a lot of people not using public transport because of the health and safety concerns. So they were reverting back to using their old private vehicle. Unfortunately, that may be an old diesel vehicle. So again, they were keeping the Car Club in situ and really heavily promoting it because they wanted to make sure that people realized that there were still alternatives and you didn't just have to go back to using your own vehicle. For us, and the next slide, please, James. For us, the next thing to really point out is that what we learned through the Highland Council, and if you want to speak to them, please let me know. They're always happy to speak to anyone about their journey, is that they're very progressive, but they could see that it wasn't just Car Club. It was the fact that it's Car Club and other modes of transport. And I think Dale reflected that staff were asking for access to public transport, micromobility, wanting better access of shared transportation. And so what we really saw is that there was an emergence of mobility as a service in and around the workforce of the Highland Council. They were talking about multimodal travel. And so for the last 2 years, we've invested heavily in working with other partners. And it was great to hear Dale sort of say that his journey is about partnership because it's the same for us. And that's where today, I'm on this presentation with Ross, talking to you about mobility as a service, because we work with Mobilio, who operate a mass platform, and we have integrated our Car Club services, our vehicle hire services into their platform, because we could see from our own customer base that that's where a lot of their employees were trending to. The idea of more choice, not restricting, but more choice in the way that people can conduct both commuting travel and business travel. So next slide, please, James. I think this is where I'm going to hand over to Ross, who's probably going to also tell you the last twist of the tail when it comes to Highland Council. So Ross, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ross. I'm Strategic Account Director for Mobilio. I'm leading our team on the integrated implementation with Dale & Co. Hence being on the call today. Next slide, please, James. So I'm going to give a brief overview or recap of mobility as a service and also touch a little on our own platform. But really, the focus for today is on the fleet manager and some sort of suggested steps to take towards future mobility in the business context. You know, it's great to be able for us to say, you know, we've got the best MaaS platform, but really that platform deployment only follows the groundwork that you'll need to do in order to get buy-in and set the scene for your business. Dale's demonstrated quite a lot of this with his presentation. Hopefully what I'm going to do now is break down an approach, the kind of approach that Dale's taken into bite-sized chunks for you guys to consider. So as a starting point, I've suggested 2 questions you can ask yourself as a fleet manager. First one, and it is a bit of a leading question, is the company vehicle exclusively the best way for my colleagues to travel on business? I.e., for every single trip, is the car better than any other option? If the answer here is yes, then job done, and the rest of this isn't for you. However, if the answer is no, then the follow-up question is, well, how do we empower colleagues to make good decisions to travel efficiently and sustainably when that car isn't the best option? And by asking this question, what we're doing is bringing in a number of themes. I mean, traveling efficiently could mean best use of time as much as it could mean lowest cost, or it could factor in safety and security. Traveling sustainably is obviously a goal in these times, but how do we quantify that sustainability? And is it purely about environmental awareness? So my aim today really is to put forward some thoughts on how to address this question too. Mobility as a service, I believe, is part of the solution, but it needs to be considered holistically rather than just as a possible tech platform. And this is retouching on a lot of what Dale was speaking about earlier. So to put these suggestions into context, first I'll recap on MaaS generally and how our platform delivers on that concept. So if we have the next slide, please, James. Thank you. So first of all, what is mobility as a service? At its heart, really, it's the ability for a user to be able to find, book and pay for multiple modes of transport within a single platform. So what a mobility as a service platform does is bring together integrations from multiple transport operators into a single platform. It gives the ability for a user to plan their journey, to pay for it either on account or by private card, as Dale mentioned earlier, hopefully saving on expense claims, and to also have fulfillment for travel in the form of tickets, codes, or whatever method is delivered into the app to allow access to transport. Now, this graphic shows the breadth of integrations our platform has had to complete in order to be able to provide a genuine choice to users, and you can see multiple modes of travel here. Can we have the next slide, please, James? So to actually build an app to deliver this choice to users, we've had to build a significant supply chain. So our partners include national and global travel providers, which allows business travel between continents, right down to micro-mobility providers to give users that crucial first and last mile and allow travel to happen seamlessly. So these integrations and the partner management really are the biggest challenge in any MaaS platform. It's not necessarily the tech. And that, when you're considering which platform to go for, that really should factor into your decision making. Have the next slide, please, James. Thank you. So when the time comes to look for certain key features in a mobility or a business travel platform, I've kind of distilled it down to three suggestions here, but you'll have your own priorities. The 3 I've gone for are ensuring you have enough choices for users with that comprehensive supply chain I mentioned earlier. Make sure you include the ability to quickly compare options such as on-road, active or public transport so that colleagues can make informed decisions based on their priorities. And also make sure that what you've got is a truly integrated solution that includes fully integrated payments and ticketing. At the end of the day, it's those relatively small barriers that can prevent that behavior change away from vehicle occupancy. And a good MaaS platform will actually remove those barriers as far as possible. However, like I mentioned earlier, the focus here really isn't the tech itself. And this brief overview of Mobilio and MaaS is really only to set the context to some of the steps that I'd suggest towards kicking off a mobility deployment. And if we can have the next slide, please, James. So first steps towards mobility as a service. Strangely, as a tech provider, I'm saying don't worry about the tech yet. So forget it for now. For me, this only follows once you and crucially, your colleagues define what mobility could and should look like for your business. There isn't any one size fits all with fleet, and the same is true of wider mobility. So let's put the shiny platform aside for now and think about the requirements for the business. And Dale's touched quite a lot on this in his presentation. So firstly, what elements of the business need to be included in this project? In the same way that your fleet will have stakeholders across the business, you'll need to engage other departments for mobility. Some of these might be new, depending on how fleet and travel are run today, and what the opportunities are that a change can bring. So the list is not exhaustive, and the responsibilities sit in different departments, business to business, and this is really just a starting point to consider. So for example, is there an opportunity for a mass platform to reduce the number of T&E expenses claims that are being made by having all purchases made through the app? If so, find the relevant stakeholder from finance or their dedicated team. Does the procurement team have negotiated rates on certain elements of travel, such as trains or hotels? Should these rates really be reflected by the platform that you choose? Also, what are the KPIs that other departments would expect to see that you may not normally consider from a fleet perspective? As Dale mentioned, talk to HR about your plans. Depending on what you're planning to implement, you might be looking at a significant shift to car policy, T&E policy, or actually the overall benefits package. So when looking at mobility, you can't approach it in a siloed fleet manner because it's wider than fleet, and you'll need to engage outside of those usual channels. Make sure you work with all stakeholders to set the strategic aims for any mass implementation. They might include cost savings, carbon reduction, more flexible benefits, better reporting, the list goes on, and they're all really individual to your business. So next, think about rollout and who is this relevant to? So this will depend on the outcome of the previous step. So for example, if the aim is to simplify access to travel and to reduce expense claims, then it might be applicable to all employees. Alternatively, you might simply have groups of company car drivers in specific locations where mobility might make more sense than company cars, in which case limit the scope accordingly. Think about how to identify those employees. For example, are they already regularly leaving the car at home and expensing travel by other modes? Or do they have a very low mileage profile to the point where the BIK on their car doesn't actually make sense? It's really important to again say, there isn't any one size fits all approach here, and it's all down to you and your relevant stakeholder groups to identify that opportunity. Can I have next slide, please, James? Thank you. Okay, so once you've outlined what you want to achieve and who should be involved, it's time for you and your stakeholders to get into the detail. Are you running any new program as a limited time pilot, or will you roll out gradually to a smaller group initially? Are the changes to be mandatory, or should the business ask for volunteers to trial mobility, and will it run alongside or in place of company cars for those trial users? Next, think about how you want employees to move around. As Dale touched on, are all modes available appropriate for your employees when traveling on business? For example, are you happy that they might be zipping around on e-scooters? Finally, make sure you've taken the time to understand any of the BIK implications. Again, Dale's touched on this previously, particularly where mobility is offered in place of a company car and is available to colleagues for private travel as well as business travel. Once you've taken these steps and you've defined the program, it's then time to consider the tech and the sort of platform that you want to provide. You know what you want to implement, you know who it's going to be targeted to. Now it's a case of finding the correct solution. And one suggestion would be to come up with a key list of functionality that you'd want to see available. I touched earlier on integrations and having sufficient choice in one place to make the platform valuable to users. You might have other requirements, such as the platform having the ability to contain and reflect T&E policy or cost limits, the ability to bill by individual cost center or to report at individual group or project level, the ability to limit travel to certain modes or to include a sign-off process for certain spends. And once you've got your list of functionality, find a provider that's got a consultative approach as well as the tech that looks sexy. The provider that wants to understand your needs and to configure a platform that's specific to your requirements. The right provider should help you in that journey to the implementation and be flexible in the way that they can deploy their platform for you. All of the questions and the suggestions I've gone through really are similar to the process that Dale talked about earlier, and we're in the midst of that currently with him and his team. The implementation there, will be live in April 2022, and we're scoping out the functionality of the platform in detail at the moment. If we can have the next slide, please, James. Thanks. Another example of this type of approach, and one that's actually quite a bit closer to going live, is with Highland Council. And this brings us full circle back to Oz's story about the success of Car Club and how that's been built on to now encompass mobility as a service for those council employees. So we went live in Scotland in June with a version of our platform called GoHi. And this is in partnership with Highlands and Islands Transport Partnership, and it's available to residents and tourists of the Scottish Highlands. Since launch, we've been working with the Highlands Council to offer more sustainable travel modes, and as I was mentioned, further reduce that reliance on grey fleet vehicles. Employees can access the same Car Club vehicles via GoHi, as well as public transport, shared bikes, buses, ferries, and more. So it's going to give the Highlands Council a centralised view of total mobility rather than the siloed department approach that they have today. We're looking at up to 500 employees initially onboarded to GoHi, and the aim will be to roll out to all employees once the platform is proven. And hopefully that's kind of squared that circle, and that's it from Oz and I. So thanks for your time, and back to James. Or to
me actually, but
sorry. Really.
Thanks very much, both. That was excellent insight. Certainly, I learnt a lot. I'd now like to hand over to Ryan, who will finish our presentation session by giving his views on mobility deployment from a fleet manager perspective. Thank you, Ryan.
Great, thanks, Julie. Thanks, James. Just to start off by saying that I'm making this presentation as an AFP committee member and in no way related to my employer. So this will be from my understanding and perspective of in that role, but no way related to that. So apologies for that. Basically, from a deployment of mobility solutions in my current function as a fleet mobility and travel manager globally, we ultimately move people and data to support customers, colleagues, partners, and shareholders, either for business or in a commuting environment under our smart working and flexible working regime that many organisations seem to be rolling out post-COVID. The majority of our travel is domestic, in country, city centre to city centre, or to customers to support insurance events. Pre-2020, we were spending close to £100 million globally across all travel products. And at the beginning of 2021, we undertook a review of what we do and how we do it, taking on board all of the good practices that had taken place in the previous year and trying to understand whether travel, when necessary, how is it undertaken and what services and SMEs can we use to support that. So where we were pre-2020 is that we were heavily focused on travel allowances and cash allowances, even if there was limited travel. Company cars were still seen as being a bit of a perk rather than an essential user. Things like car parking spaces were delivered on length of service rather than need. Travel, whether it was hotel, rail, air, daily rental, car clubs, were all centrally booked, centrally settled. And we had multiple suppliers globally that were trying to deliver a single policy product. And one of the first things we did is we looked at how we could integrate that globally and reduce cost and improve behaviours. One of the first things that we did was to remove all cash allowances and mobility allowances, so going against some of the things that Dale, Oz and Roz have been talking about, because we found that the seniority of people that were receiving those allowances weren't the ones that were actually travelling for business. So we moved to a claim when necessary and payment solution. We reviewed our essential user fleet programme, and we now have an annual review of job need, and put in place public transport solutions for out-of-town office locations to support our reduction in office car parking options. We moved to an individual booking and payment with expenses claimed for travel and mileage, which delivered on self-governance, and moved to global supply partners across travel, fleets and mobility across our global operations, not necessarily putting all of our eggs in one basket, particularly in the UK market, where the provision of UK domestic rail alongside hotel and air is a challenging scenario given the complexities of a divested UK rail market. An increased promotion of active travel solutions, particularly around walking and cycling, working very closely with our group property and facilities teams to ensure that we had suitable facilities in place to allow people to secure their cycles securely, have access to shower facilities and changing facilities to make it as easy as possible. And then we developed our own in-house car share scheme as well, linked in with our city centre car parking solution and the tactical deployment of pool cars as well. Our in-house car share scheme has come to the fore really in our rollout of a new smart car parking solution. Again, where previously car parking spaces were assigned on length of service, they're now based on need, regardless of length of service or seniority. We've only been able to do this through the support of our TMCs and our lease providers, and Enterprise as one of our key partners through LeasePlan has been keen in that daily rental, car club and longer term rental requirements, particularly with the ongoing semiconductor issues in terms of essential user fleet programs. So some of the reasons why we looked at those changes at early 2020, and I'll go into some more of the reasons a bit later on, were we found that allowances were driving the wrong behaviours, that people were, those that were entitled to allowance, a non-pensionable allowance, were then utilising other forms of mobility. But we're also finding that travel instances declined as and when allowances were used up. From a risk point of view, we also found that perhaps the right mode of transport wasn't being taken, or people were travelling at very early or very late off-peak travel times in order to make the most of their travel allowance, and then getting to the end of the financial year and then having a big blowout on business class flights, first class rail travel, or more expensive hotels. I mentioned that we moved to a self-settle and reclaim process, which encouraged self-governance. You will only be asked once or twice by your line manager why you are putting a particular claim for anything before you toe the party line and develop those good behaviours. And whilst we have an increase in back office costs, it has significantly reduced our out of policy spend, which is supported by our TMC and lease partners. There was also a focus on those low business miles. We had, at 2020, we had a number of vehicles that were provided as perk that had seen 0 business mile claims. And ultimately, as was mentioned by Dale, Oz and Ross earlier, this is all about doing our bit towards supporting the works that need to be undertaken to reverse the climate emergency situation that we have at this moment in time. Our starting point, I suppose, was data, much like everybody's talking about at the moment. If you know what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, then data is key. So we looked at who's travelling where and for what reason, and ultimately provided solutions for point-to-point and multiple trips in a single day. Having a glass ceiling of 9,000, 10,000 business miles before becoming eligible for a company car is not the be all and end all. If you're rural Norfolk or the Scottish Highlands, where actually the provision of car clubs, daily rental, public transport is limited, a company provided vehicle is most probably the best solution when you take into account cost, time, well-being, risk and sustainability. We mentioned earlier about the allowance takers and travel behaviour. That was key in driving down some costs within the business, along with asset utilisation. We worked very closely with our lease partner in terms of the redeployment of our reallocation vehicles, particularly during COVID, where drivers were keen to hand back their vehicles and not pay the benefit in kind, despite HMRC's reluctance to change the BIQ guidance about vehicles still being available for use even if you don't use them. And then commuting. is a big thing for us, and this goes into our science-based targets, scope 1, 2 and 3 commitments by 2030, at looking at company provided fleet, business travel and grey fleet solutions. We've refocused our travel and commuting program, travel and commuting, can't get my word out, program to be purposeful rather than permissive. So working hand in hand with smart working and flexible working within our office, we've been able to look at our office locations and downsize our property portfolio, looking at a 60% occupancy at in every location, and encouraging people to work from home and only really coming into the office when it is for a need. Over the last 18 months, I've been in the office most probably every single day. We put out a guidance document to colleagues saying from the 19th of July, we would expect to see more people coming in to offices, just to sort of create that buzz within the workplace. And on the very first day of that, I was sat next to a team of 12 people that spent the entire day on Teams calls. Now, the question of whether that's purposeful or not comes to mind. I don't think they even got up to go out for a cup of tea together. We're also providing products alongside our airline partners, hotel partners, and with our EV100 commitments as well, utilising those subject matter experts in terms of car share, bike storage, showers, bike charge points, EV charge points, and to come later on this year, early part of next year, we're launching a salary sacrifice scheme for battery electric vehicles only. So a focus on that long-term scope 3 science-based target. Ultimately, as the industry that I work in, we're focused on risk, and one of the big things that we are keen to do is make sure that we have the right mode of transportation for the type of journeys that are being undertaken, and the majority of these are either colleagues with tech equipment, laptops, that sort of thing, or they are engineers and assessors that will have estate vehicles that are full of bits of kit and drones and ladders and tools. But in order to get buy-in on this, then we've had to approach C-suite and get our chief operating officer, a gentleman called Nick Amin, to cascade our objective of being net zero by 2030 across all operations, and then net zero by 2040 across all products that we sell and investments. And that's involved significant conversations with representative bodies within key focus groups, and then user forums, and not least employees, where we've had to sell the benefits that I've mentioned before, not just in terms of being cost effective, but in terms of reducing congestion, improving air quality, and reducing carbon. Our final part in terms of our engagement in mobility development is how we continue to evolve. So we've recently announced a 5-year partnership with Darwin Innovation Group on autonomous vehicles, and we have a trial out at Harwell Science and Innovation Campus in Oxford. Part of this as an insurance organisation is understanding the risks element. We worked very closely with Tesla in Canada, and have done over the last 15 to 20 years to understand autonomous vehicle introduction within the market and how this will impact our shareholders and risk appetite. But in order to, I mentioned earlier about the employee element, but in order to move our people over into a more sustainable and lack of ownership mentality when it comes to business travel and commuting, we need to ensure that we've got the right partners in place to deliver an easy and hassle-free solution. Sometimes where the higher cost is actually the more cost-effective solution when you take into account single day or overnight travel, employee well-being, sickness, and time off. And one of the things that we do is we survey our colleagues that have been on long journeys away from home to understand how their travel experience has impacted them when they've got back to their loved ones back at home. Has it taken them 2 days to get over it, which means that they've been traveling Monday to Friday and their weekend is spent getting ready for work again on a Monday. And a real focus within the industry at the moment is on mental health well-being and the ability for people to make personal decisions that maybe your line manager would prefer you to get a 5 o'clock flight out of Dublin, but actually that's not good for you in the long term. It needs to be timely. Looking at some of our key routes, particularly in the UK from Edinburgh down to London, the perception of 2 hours of queuing up at an airport, 40-minute flight, half an hour to get back into central London versus 4 or 5 hours on a train is something that we are working on and publicising, and we're working very closely with our train line and train operating company partners to try and incentivise and bring back the appeal of the good old days of rail. But ultimately, we have a focus on sustainability and reduced risk. So it's about having the right product in the right place, and giving people the insight into the impact that their travel has on the environment, whether it's through increased congestion or through emissions. So our focus really, and not to teach anybody to suck eggs here in terms of the travel hierarchy, is obviously we prefer people to walk and wheel wherever they can, and cycle from a commuting point of view. From a risk element, being city centre location, we do not encourage the use of cycling for business. Primarily, if you think of things like Beryl bikes or Boris bikes with a cage on the front, if you've got your laptop bag in there, there's just a risk element. And as a financial services industry, we need to make sure that we protect all of our assets, both people and property, as much as we can. A focus on public transport and then car share, particularly in our out-of-town office locations, working with people like Perth and Kinross Council and Glasgow City Council to provide bespoke or public sharing solutions that may result in a change of route for existing services to allow people to use public transportation rather than getting in their own car, providing car share solutions where needs must, but actually reducing the amount of car parking spaces that we do have available, which both supports our cost drives, and then encouraging people not to travel unless it's purposeful, and then relying on the car parking booking tools that we have. And if there is no space available, then looking at public transport solutions. Rolling out our EV100 commitments by 2025 to be fully electric and plug-in hybrid by 2025 across our key operating locations. But ultimately with an understanding from C-suite and senior management that by looking at alternative methods of transportation rather than simple point-to-point in a personal vehicle, there will be impacts in terms of time, cost, and a balance on employee well-being. So what we've done so far is we have published our climate action plan for 2040 and committed to EV100 by 2025. We have a real focus on travel with a preference for rail and public transport over air, even if there is a significant impact in terms of time, and engage with our supply partner network as part of our annual RFPs, both air, rail and hotel. We're committing to increased charging spaces for both cars and bikes, and working with our SME TMC partners on supporting a complete end-to-end point-to-point ground transportation solution, which will result with our TMC in the rollout of a new online mobile booking tool, which will give our colleagues the ability to book point-to-point when needed. We are continue to promote season ticket loans and have been working with our train operating company partners about part-time season tickets, which I know is pretty important, particularly in places like London, where cost of season tickets are particularly high. And what's to come in the future? We've got the salary sacrifice development, we've got the development of our TMC and lease provider partner, and our salary sacrifice by Q1 2022. So just to finish off, I think just to reflect what Dale, Oz and Ross have said is that ground transport mobility solutions must work hand in hand with your travel programme. Fleet is just one stream to a true mobility solution, and one size does not necessarily fit all at this moment in time. Our focus on purposeful travel is being delivered by our partners with a focus on net zero. However, our ability to flex that partner supply chain as both demand changes and new products come to market is key. The travel and fleet industry is one of those that is forever evolving, and the push away from ownership has been a challenge, particularly given the lower BIK on EV. And I'm sure, as many fleet managers will experience, more and more people are now coming back saying they would like to participate in the fleet program again, and moving away from a perk to an essential user, and then delivering on a salary sacrifice option is key to making sure that people are making the right choices when it comes to those solutions when they do want their own personal vehicle. Just to finish off, I'll do a bit of plug for AFP in that the mobility roadmap will be published shortly. It's a key document in stimulating thought process, and then has been key in the discussions that I've been having with my lease provider and my global travel management company. So I'm sure Julie or James will give some more information on that, but keep an eye out on the AFP website for that.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That's great, and thanks for the plug. Yes, I will be just touching on that also. I'd like to start the Q&A session now. We've already received a number of questions. The first being, what has been the trickiest part of engaging your business about offering drivers a mobility solution? Dale, can I ask that of you first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say we haven't done a massive engagement on this piece. Yes, we've engaged to get approval. So I think that the test of this will be how we start engaging with people from this point onwards. We've talked to lots of groups separately across the organisation who are supportive of the principles, but always I think the devil is in the detail. So the engagement about this at a very individual level will happen in Q1 of next year.
Yeah, Ryan, have you got a view on this?
We are not pushing out a mobility solution in terms of allowance at the moment. The hardest part for us has been whole life costs in personal mobility, particularly with the rollout of EV fleets, and as an organisation that historically have got drivers that have maybe been in company cars for 20 years or so. That whole mindset change away from personal ownership of vehicle to utilising public transportation when suitable, or looking at car clubs. A great example is we have an IT van that we've had on lease for the last 3 years, and it's done about 1,500 miles in those 3 years. Whereas parked right outside is a Norfolk Car Club van that is available on contactless payment straight away, and with budgets being held by individual cost centres, not centrally, the ability to remove what's a perceived benefit from cost centre owners is a challenge because they've already budgeted for it.
Yeah. Okay. Second question, does a mobility offering need to save the business money? If so, how does this get defined? Oz, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think it absolutely can save money. I think when Dale talked about having good data, a lot of the projects we launch, you're looking at the benchline, of the data that you're going to be judging success by, and success sometimes is defined by cost savings or financial savings. But it's also, there are other aspects to what you could define as successful. But I think having really good data, that's intelligent data, allows you to then start bringing scale into some of these mobility solutions. And I think most strong business cases when you're deploying, say, a car club or a mass program or an alternative to a company car scheme would be looking at maybe the capital versus the OPEX, the savings, a long-term view in it, not just necessarily a 12-month view, but what are the changing behaviors going to do in terms of the investment or the savings that you can deliver. But savings also can not just be financial, it can be things like CO2, your reduction in terms of NOx, but also then don't underestimate the journey itself. I think within that business case for success has to be, is this a better or experience for the end user, and hence the engagement piece is really important. So that's how I would answer that question. I think savings is important, but it's not the only definition of success.
Ross, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Oz has largely covered it. The only aspect to kind of emphasize really is define what you want to save. You know, what are the key savings? Is it financial? Is it decarbonisation? What are you looking as a business to achieve? And make sure that the deployment and the project as a whole reflects that strategy.
Yeah. Okay. Third question is quite topical. There will be a worry by ex-drivers about availability of vehicles to use. How do you overcome this? Is that for you, Oz?
Yeah, so availability, I suppose a good example for me is when we launched Car Club, we often, biggest concern is, you know, an employee base may have historically had access to a really underutilized fleet that was, as Dale pointed, mainly parked up in the car park, and visually it looks like it's available to you, but it's not very practical, and actually it's having a big issue in terms of just not being used, and it's costing the organization a lot of money, but also it's not environmentally friendly. So then when you bring in a smart car club program that runs driven, not booked, typically around the 70 to 80% utilization, you're going to see less of them in the car park, because guess what? They're doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is they're being used for very short journeys, and actually people are sharing that asset as well. So it's not just carrying one occupant, it may have two or three. So we always have that anxiety when we deploy our programs, when people realize that actually just because you can't see the asset in the car park doesn't mean it's not available to you. And that's where I think the point Dale and Ross and Ryan were making, that technology plays a really good part of awareness, but also giving you a very intuitive way to book, you know, or plan, book and pay for that trip or the vehicle, the asset you want to access. So there's always going to be anxiety, but I think people soon realize that actually a combination of the asset integrated with the technology is going to actually probably give them more reassurance. And I think from my experience, that on-demand access, people really like that. They're in control. The fact that they can book it, edit it, you know, extend it, off-hire it, all in real time, and the fact that it's all showing up on a system, that it's now being made available to you, I think that gives a lot of confidence. But anxiety exists, whether it's EV, whether it's, you know, moving to a shared asset program, whether it's, you know, accessing electrification. So, but definitely not something to be considered as a barrier, just more about your methodology and engagement with staff or the general public.
Yeah. And Dale, do you have any experience of this? Have you had, or do you anticipate ex-drivers having these anxieties?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point, actually, because, you know, one of the exercises we're going through at the moment is, particularly since we've just going through post-COVID kind of arrangements, you know, for people who have a critical role. So in other words, if there are people who need to respond operationally to something for whatever reason, you know, whether it's an incident or health and safety matters or whatever, then clearly they need to have access to a car 24/7. And so for those people, that solution will not work. But for the vast majority of people where, you know, 70%, 80% of our business is on a plan basis. So for those people, we can put those plans in place and give them that comfort and confidence. And for some of it, you know, the thing I didn't mention was, you know, we'll use car share, but we'll also use things like pool cars that will have car share technology installed in it, so that our own pool car can be booked in an easier way, perhaps, for people on the same platform. So I think it's about horses for courses, and generally, if people have a concern about availability, it might be because the role they're in is critical, in which case we put arrangements in place for that critical role. So for us, for example, when we have a big incident, we might, for example, book 3 or 4 hire cars for the next 2 days to make sure we got enough cars for that response. But that is still a better option than having those 4 cars permanently on the fleet.
Yeah. Okay. here's one for you, I think, Ryan. In your opinion, is a mobility allowance the new cash allowance?
Crikey. Well, having moved away from a cash allowance, I don't know. I mean, I'm a big fan of data, unfortunately, and I think there are situations where allowances drive the wrong behaviours. I think an integrated mobility solution where, regardless of, so if you've got a structure in place that says we have a purposeful travel program that's either through essential need, as Dale just mentioned earlier, or it's a so health and safety or event management, anything like that, but actually the cost of that is something that the business is prepared to pay in order to deliver to their customers and their shareholders, then I don't think having an allowance is the right methodology for that, because it will either stop people doing it, or it will create time lag in availability. So a really good example is not within this in my particular company, but I'm aware of a particular member of staff had their company car taken away from them because they weren't hitting their 9,000 miles. It was particularly customer focused role, got a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, I need you to be here straight away. And then ran back and said, my car's being delivered at 9 o'clock in the morning. And I'll be there by 12. Well, we want you there straight away. It just can't be done. I think if you're in an organization that has the needs of customers at the heart of what it does, you will pay the price. It's about how do you put it in there? Do you give people the mobility or the cash allowance and maybe they don't spend it in the right way? Or do you just say, when you need to spend it, claim it, we will pay for it, providing it's permissive, purposeful rather.
Yeah.
So no, I'm not a fan of allowances.
Dale, have you got a view?
Yeah, I think we're, my initial thought is we're probably too early in the process to understand how that might work. And I agree with Ryan. What we don't want to be doing is driving the unintended consequences. We can't be doing that. What we're trying to do here is shift behaviours. And if an allowance allows us to do that, whether it be a carbon allowance or a mobility allowance, then great. But if it doesn't drive that, then I wouldn't want it. So part of our pilot is to understand what creates the best kind of lever to change people's behaviours. So I think there is no answer that's perfect at the moment, but part of the trial we're doing is to try and help us understand that a bit more, to understand what would work.
Yeah. Okay.
Julie,
yes, sorry.
I was just going to add, I think on top of what Dale and Ryan said there, maybe alongside an allowance scheme, you've got a rewards and incentive program. Yeah. So maybe you're driving people to change behavior, and then when they adopt that new behavior, you're rewarding them or incentivizing them. So I think, how you position it or how you sell it, I think there also needs to be a bit of a reward associated with that sort of allowance that's instigating change. So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What internal stakeholders do I as a fleet manager need to be dealing with in order to bring this to life? Now, we have mentioned HR as an obvious one, but who else does a fleet manager need to engage with? Ryan, do you want to give us some thoughts on that?
I would ultimately say your C-suite, so whoever you report into, your chief operating officer in my case, is key, particularly as you're looking at rolling out a cultural shift in terms of people's perceptions of mobility, moving away from the 3 Series BMW diesel vehicle to EV or non-ownership or other mobility solutions. And primarily that is around getting their support and buy-in, so you can use it as in effect a top trump card. I had a colleague the other day who categorically told me their line manager was going to allow them to order their diesel Skoda Octavia because of the miles they do, and the conversation was going very politely until the moment he mentioned his director's name and I could mention the chief operating officer's name. It soon brings people back on board to understand that there is a need within the business for people to look at the climate challenges that we've got, and everybody needs to play their part on that. So ultimately I would say however far up the C-suite you can, get them to do that. Our Chief Operating Officer is key sponsor on our partnership with Darwin. He's also our signatory on EV100, and our Chief Executive Officer is up at COP26 and will be presenting there on the climate emergency within the financial services industry, along with our CEO of the investors part of the business, who will be looking at what organisations should do in terms of funding and putting money aside to support their own climate action plans. So, yeah, ultimately, I would say go to your director and then go as high up the C-suite ladder as you can.
Yeah, and Dale?
Yeah, I think there's a number of people you need to engage on this in terms of, we obviously need to involve our procurement commercial colleagues, and one of the things we're discovering in our pilot is, what sort of agreements do you need to have in place? They're probably not your normal agreements, so you need to just sort that through and make sure what you're doing is viable and within the boundaries of what your contract arrangements are. And I think the second one, unless it's rare that a fleet manager or head of fleet, whatever you want to call it, has full responsibility for all travel options. So, for example, facilities might manage your rail travel, your hotel travel. Other people might look after your property, in terms of pool cars and car club and all the rest of it. So I think you've got to think about your whole estate and how it functions and understand who needs to be involved. HR will also almost certainly have a view on this in terms of, is it a benefit, is it not a benefit? And Oz mentioned a while back, is there any financial benefits? That once you've gone past that seeding of the market and understanding, you would hope to see some economic benefits as well as carbon benefits. So clearly finance would want to understand what the return on investment is and to plan on that basis. So I think, this is no different to any other project in the sense it probably involves a lot of different parts of your own organisation, depending on how you're structured, but keep them all engaged, keep them all involved. And probably the one that we haven't mentioned is trade unions.
Yeah.
Trade unions may well see this as a reduction in a benefit, or they may see this as a change in people's working patterns. So again, early engagement with all your trade unions or through a national negotiating group is really important to understand how their members might feel and to engage with them and get them on board. They may never be on board, but at least if you can try and engage people, you can try and understand the logic and try and look at how it might work. We further involve, we have network groups. So we have lots of different groups of people. So it might be a women's network or a part-time network or a mobility network. So we engage with all those different networks of people who come together to share ideas and thoughts. So the more, the better, really.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, just one final question for everyone, but we'll start with Ross on this one. But so what uptake is the panel seeing from the mobility offerings in the UK? Ross?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it depends on the context. So we provide mobility schemes both to public sector for general retail usage as well as business travel. What I would say is we've seen really good uptake in the retail world. However, the better uptake is in the business travel world. And typically that's because our tool is used as a business travel tool and it's mandated. So we see far greater take up and far higher usage as a proportion when you consider the number of users that sit on either version of the platform. It's delivered some really interesting data to us, and that's sort of insight that we're now able to provide to the likes of Dale and to the likes of Highlands Council to say this is the type of usage that we're seeing typically, and these are the sorts of modes that get used, and these are the ones that don't get used. So these are maybe the ones that we want to prioritise for different users. But to answer your question without waffling on, I think the greater proportion is seen in the business travel world. Yeah.
Oz?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer if you build it, they'll come. We're seeing really good adoption in terms of whether you're deploying simple solutions, may just be a car club solution supporting existing business travel plan, or if you're looking at a more integrated solution. I think we often forget in a deployment of mobility to spend time and invest in your marketing plan. because you've got to have a very clear communication to the end users to why you're asking them to change and what the benefits are. And so I think that's where I think, if you're ever looking to deploy, make sure you're very clear and have a good marketing strategy of how you're going to deploy and what you're communicating as well. Adoption is, in my experience, down to people actually using the services. So again, my point there would be reward and incentivize to get people to physically go and, use a bike hire or get on that train or actually walk for the first 10 minutes, because that's what the algorithm is telling them to do. Sounds simple, but you actually have to instigate that change. And how you do that, I think you have many things at your disposal. And I think some of that is policy led, but some of that is also show and tell and trial and trials like Dale and Ryan, what they're doing as well. So, but see adoption being high when people use the services. So I hope that answers your question, but definitely exciting times.
Do you think there's a stepping stone approach to it, Oz?
Yeah, I think there is.
We can all agree that it's a huge task, and Dale has said that this is a major journey for them. Yeah. But is there a stepping stone approach?
It's interesting because I've been working with Dale for a number of years, and it's been a journey, but it's probably been a journey full of experiences. And some of them have been, really exciting, and others have been mistakes that we've learned from and we've been able to adapt and evolve. But the stepping stone is, I think, just even if you look at your existing travel policy and compare that to kind of the way people would want to travel and the engagement you're doing with them, there's going to be some gaps. But I don't think the point is that you're restricting people. You're just giving them more choice, is what I'm seeing, the more progressive travel policy. I think a lot of organizations may already be deploying a travel management company. And so that's probably a good starting place for them to say, how does that supply chain in relation to my travel policy allow me to move to a more progressive travel policy that's adopting sustainable travel? And I think it will show the gaps. Also, I think most of us will probably be happy to share existing data and implementation plans. So we often focus on data, but actually the methodology of how you deploy is as important. So again, we'd be happy to share some of that and what's good, bad, and indifferent. So yeah, there's definitely stepping stones.
Yeah. Has anybody else on the panel got a view on that?
Julie, I would just say probably, every organisation has a different approach to this. So, do you want to be a pioneer? Do you want to be an early adopter? Do you want to be a mass adopter? And that's probably for everything that's one of these changes. I think we're probably at that point where it's moving from pioneering to early adoption. And as soon as we start moving much more into early adoption, we'll start seeing the mass approach. If I was to put a number on it, I'd say we're probably a few years away from getting that bigger adoption of it. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this might work. But, looking at between now and 2030, I think by the time we get to 2030, there'll be a lot of this about, will be the next thing. And, the same way that petrol companies are moving to EVs and having more charge points installed, petrol and diesel will become a thing of the past beyond 2030. And it'll be hydrogen and all sorts of other things. So it's about how quick you want to start that journey and whether you want to be that pioneer or early adopter, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, guys. I'll leave the questions there. I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking you, Dale, Oz, Ross, and Ryan, for your contribution today. And hope you all found the webinar as interesting as I did. As mentioned previously, we'll be including the webinar recording into the AFP website for future member reference. Please do have a browse of our website. It's been recently updated, so there's lots of information for you there. Just a few things to bring to your attention before we go. Our next webinar is to be held on Wednesday, the 15th of December, starting at 9:30 again. We'll be looking at alternative types of transport usage in your fleet policy. So again, it's going to be an interesting one. Please be aware that AFP's 2021 webinar programme has been open to everyone. Moving forward, it will only be available to members. So I would strongly encourage you to all join AFP to continue to benefit from the access to the webinar programs. Okay, next, can I ask that you help us by completing our EV Hub survey? It's sponsored by Nissan. If you go onto the website and click on the link to the new EV Hub and Select survey, this is a new monthly survey which will help us to be better informed about any hot topics that you want us to cover, both in webinars, seminars, etc., and importantly committee agendas. This month's survey focuses on EV reimbursement, so please do get involved in that. I'd also like to advise of the launch of the new document which Ryan referred to, the AFP Mobility Roadmap. Is available to members only and is available from our AFP office. If you speak to Lynn Eldridge, you can contact her by phone on 01243 607 591. She'll be able to share the documents with you. Last but not least, I'd also like to remind you of our training programme. We've got the electric LCV training course on the 20th of October, which is available to members and non-members. It's being run by Paul Kirby, who most of us will know is our, LCV expert. So if you want to sign up, the details are on the website under training. So please, please do that. And I think that's it for this morning. Thank you once again for attending and for your time, and look forward to seeing you all again in December at our next webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye now.